Richard Gage is an architect who has been speaking publicly for more than 18 years about the explosive evidence at the World Trade Center on 9/11. Richard is the founder and former CEO architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, which now has over 3,600 architects and engineers signed onto the public petition demanding a new World Trade Center investigation. He's the leading expert and the presenter spearheading the 9/11 Truth movement, having given more than 650 presentations in 24 countries and 118 American cities with an equal number of radio and TV interviews. So welcome, Richard, to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Awesome to be here.
Thank you.
It's great to have you.
It's great. Okay, so could you please just tell us about your background and qualifications?
You bet. So altogether, about 36 years as an architect, and I just got sidetracked from my career 18 years ago. As you mentioned, I heard a crazy radio interview. Found out that there was a third tower that came down on 9/11. And this was just shocking to me. It's 47 stories tall. And we didn't get one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history. So I'm going, what world am I living in? Then I found out the evidence for the two twin towers that they came down very explosively, which we'll talk about today. And so it just stopped me in my tracks. I had to find out if this was true, and all of it was. So I started talking to people and developed an organization. And yeah, thousands of architects.
Year was that? About
2007.
Oh, so you're late in the game. Compared with others like David Ray Griffin.
Yeah, some of them came in right away. 2001, 2, 3. Yeah. Stephen Jones came in before me. I think Kevin Ryan did. And David Ray Griffin, as you mentioned, who's a mentor of mine. In fact, it was his presentation or interview on the radio that just alerted me to all of this. It was just shocking.
Okay, so take us back to how the world was geopolitically at the turn of the century and how September 11th changed everything. Was September 11th the original sin of the 21st century?
Well, I guess it was 2001. My goodness, never quite thought of it that way. We were told we had 19 fundamentalist hijackers taking these planes and running them into these buildings. But not only do we have evidence that we'll talk about today of these buildings being explosively demolished, but that the hijackers may not have even been on the planes, certainly not in control of them. And there are others who have expertise in that area. In fact, on September 8th, there's going to be a seminar on that very topic put out by the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And that is for the website ic911.org. So I plan on tuning into that and learning more on that subject myself.
So the crimes of September 11th seem to be comparable with the Christmas gift that just keeps on giving. There's no end of the mileage the elites have milked from it. So it turned the entire world into the giant terror state.
No, it did. You're absolutely right. The coalition of the forced was gathered under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, where NATO members were drafted into invading Afghanistan and then Iraq. And this turned out in Afghanistan the longest war in our history. What were we after there? If Osama bin Laden was not responsible for these attacks, and it was some sort of an inside false flag operation, which I believe that the controlled demolition of these towers, as we'll prove, implies a false flag operation. So why were we in Afghanistan? Well, we'll talk about that afterward if we have time. We're talking about the 90% of the world's opium production, which is 4 times the profits from all the oil companies put together. Incredible profits.
Did you say opium?
Opium.
Poppies?
Yes, poppies.
In Afghanistan. And that's interesting, the connection between the CIA and drug dealing and that whole nexus. But why don't you go through the explosive evidence that grabbed your attention and that you've dedicated so much of your time to?
Oh, you bet. Very happy to do that because, and I start, by the way, with the 3rd tower that came down on 9/11. And that was building 7. And it just takes a lot of courage to understand what's really happened here. And we want everybody to know. And that's why I'll do, we want everybody who's viewing this presentation to know too, but not just you, but everybody that you know, who you're willing to share this information with, because it's got to get out widely. We have, after all, the 3rd worst structural failure in modern times. I got to grab that other
And I guess that's why Building 7 was the wild cards in the whole affair, I guess.
Building 7 is the wild card. We call it the smoking gun of 9/11, as a matter of fact. So most people don't know anything about it. Most architects and engineers know nothing about it. As I mentioned, the American Institute of Architects, 90,000 members, not one bulletin on this, after the Twin Towers, the worst structural failure in modern history. And this is 47 stories tall, is no slouching building. It's the tallest building in most of our states here in the US. It was only dwarfed next to the Twin Towers, which were the tallest buildings in the world at the time that they were assembled in 1973. But the Building 7 was about a football field in length away from the North Tower. And it came down in the afternoon, about 7 hours after the Twin Towers. But here it is standing just fine when the towers came down. And this is what happens to it. Let's just go right into it, huh? The east penthouse on the left side, on the top, falls in an isolated event. And then 7 seconds later, the entire building does this. And we're going to break this down. You might have seen this before, like for us in the US, it's the old hotels in Las Vegas. There was a report on the collapse of this building. We'll look at that in some detail. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, they said what? Well, they said this.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Fires. Okay, well, let's look at those fires, shall we? These are the largest fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. As you can see, they're few, they're small, and they're scattered. And they were burned out in the area of interest of NIST, which is in the northeast corner, specifically around column 79.
Yeah,
so
when you say NIST, can you clarify what NIST is for the listeners?
Yes, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the US that was tasked by our Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. And they determined that this building came down by these fires. Well, in order to make that claim, they had to really grossly exaggerate the nature of these fires in their computer model, which you see here. But the photographs betray that quite a bit. In fact, they show the fires burned out in this area more than an hour before the building came down. And that's relevant because fires have never brought down a steel frame fire protected structure ever in history. And then we have a lot of examples of much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in these buildings, such as these fires, which are fully engulfed, right? And these happen after 9/11. Again, not one of them has dropped. This is type 1 construction. It's designed to be an incinerator. It will burn everything inside of it before it ever collapses. And history bears that out. So we got to ask ourselves, well, maybe how did this building come down? Well, let's look at some of these controlled demolitions on the left compared to Building 7 on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation? Very similar, yeah.
Very similar, yeah.
Enough to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never in history brought down such a building. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, let's get serious here. Let's look at some of the typical features of controlled demolition and see if Building 7 has any of these. Okay, well, let's walk through them. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, here's Dan Rather narrating his view of this building
and what you're seeing are high shots
and its collapse.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down?
It's intriguing to me that sometimes the reporting that's closest to the event is actually the most honest, because they're believing their eyes. They haven't been told not to believe their senses. And that's an example of that. Dan Rather, his first observation, it looks like a controlled demolition.
Yep. And he has never spoken those words, by the way, since. Maybe he was told not to. We've never seen this building come down on mainstream media, except for one, possibly two occasions. It was just swept under the rug. They did not play it after the day of 9/11.
But yet somehow didn't the BBC report it falling before it even happened? And
yeah, we'll get to that. Well, and we'll show you that too.
And is there evidence of explosives in the debris?
You bet. We're going to show you that too. We're going to walk through everything here. In fact, first, feature number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Well, let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. The building is falling straight down through tons of structure, 40,000 tons. How do you do that? You have to remove all the core columns within an instant, a fraction of a second. Any deviation to that pattern, the building will begin to tip over. And then followed about a second later by the perimeter columns. So that's the only way you can bring a building straight down. Are these fires going to have that level of precision? No, they're certainly not. And so here's what happens if you don't have that level of precision.
Ooh.
Things can go wrong, right? Or it can just stop and somebody has to go back into that building and fix that dud of a controlled demolition. No, it's got to be perfect. And because buildings that are injured on one side, like building 7 was, because they said that the column 79 on the northeast corner fell. Well, if that's true, this is what you would expect. Buildings tip over toward their injured side, their damaged side. Like in that case, that's not good. You don't want that to happen. This is the column that NIST theorized collapsed or buckled after succeeding floors failed in what they called a progressive collapse. And so if column 79 were to fail, it being in the corner of the building, as you might recall here, we have column 79. If that collapsed first, which they claim it did, the building would have fallen toward this side of it. So how fast did it fall? Let's look at the work of physics teacher David Chandler. He documents that it falls at free fall acceleration for at least a third of its 7-second fall. Well, wait a minute. It's falling that fast, and this is even acknowledged by NIST. That's as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. It's actually accelerated straight down. And a bowling ball can do that because it has no resistance under it. But buildings have, this one, 40,000 tons of structural steel, 3 to 5 times stronger than they needed to be to support the building. Where did the steel go? All that steel had to be removed in order for this building to fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. Free fall acceleration. The steel didn't even slow down the collapse of the building. Again, what can do that? These fires? No, not going to happen. So we look at feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the steel structure. We had a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame skyscraper collapse like a house of cards to a 4 or 6-story pile. Well, this is built with steel that's welded, columns to beams, very rigidly welded to each other. But it appears that they have been severed one from another. Buildings that fall due to natural causes, the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The building is recognizable as a building, not a house of cards, typically. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So something else is going on with Building 7, and we can get a clue at what really brought it down, because it is unlikely to be these fires. So what might that be? Well, do we have any witnesses that heard sounds of explosions? Like this one, Daryl, a medical student.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
Wow, that's helpful. He was interviewed that evening because he was still around the area, as was Kevin McPadden. No, he was in the area, but this interview happened later. He is an Air Force medic who was on site helping with search and rescue. What did he experience?
You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman, Bill Rosati, who saw flashes of light.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
Okay, that's very helpful. And this first responder, FDNY Captain Richard Patterson.
1-7 let go as well, and was a series of concussive explosions.
And another first responder, Patrick Dillon.
I remember feeling that like it was like freight trains underneath the earth, shaking the earth, even shaking me. That's when we all saw Building 7 crumple in the middle, like way up at the top. It buckled and then dropped.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who was in the building, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess. They were called to a meeting, but they were late, and everybody else had already evacuated out of the building because the plane hit the tower. But the towers haven't come down yet, and this is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions. You know,
also the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
And more than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Bombs? Bombs like this heard by the first responders the late morning of 9/11 in the vicinity of Building 7?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
How many of these explosions do you imagine were included in any of the reports by NIST? Zero. Not one of these witnesses of explosions. And yet they claim there were no explosions at Building 7, except for some of the beams that hit it later on when the towers were destroyed. And so we have to ask ourselves, if this was a controlled demolition, maybe people would know about it in advance. And they did. Like the department chief who announced an imminent collapse, Deputy Chief Nick Visconti. We're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down. So he's telling us that it's going to come down. It has a few scattered fires in it, and no building's ever come down in history, a type 1 fire resistive construction. And yet this one's coming down. And Chief Hayden, same thing. And it gets even more interesting.
Well, we had our special operations people set up surveying instruments to monitor and see if there was any movement in the building. We're concerned of the possibility of collapse of the building. And we had a discussion with one particular engineer there, and we asked him if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and if so, how soon? And it turned out that he was pretty much right on the money, that he said in its current state you have about 5 hours.
So an anonymous engineer is announcing that the building is going to collapse in about 5 hours, even though no type 1 fire resistive construction building has ever collapsed in history. But this one's going to collapse in 5 hours. Pretty darn interesting. And we don't get to know who this engineer is. They just won't tell us. How about these mysterious? Yeah.
No, go on, please.
How about these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then saying this right into the CNN camera.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
Oh, not only is it coming down, but the building's about to blow up. So they know how it's coming down. Well, that's pretty darn interesting. And who are these guys? They're not rescue workers. They're construction workers of some kind. Very interesting. Let's learn more about what happened in this building, but let's do that with Kevin McPadden, who was previously our witness of explosions. Now, before that, he was standing about 6 blocks behind. They were all held back because they're expecting this building to come down. He's listening to a radio held in the hands of what he believed to be a Red Cross worker. And he hears this.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Whoa. Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns?
That sounds like a countdown. Yeah. I'm wondering, are these covert operation guys?
Who?
Those that put the explosions in the building, put the charges in the building.
Inevitably, yeah, this is a covert operation of sorts. Yeah, and we'll talk about who they might have been also. But like you said before, Patrick, 20 minutes before Building 7 ever came down, the BBC's announcing it as if it happened. Listen.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. The building is still behind her. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does this make them psychic? What's really going on here?
Especially since you could not predict the fall of Building 7, since no building had ever fallen in that way in the history of the world. For them to predict it ahead of time means that someone at the BBC was in on the fix. I mean,
foreknowledge.
Have they been audited? Has there been any investigation? Is the fox guarding the hen house?
Yeah, it's the fox guarding the hen house, because you ask them about this and they give you all kinds of answers that don't make any sense, like NIST did. And the same with CNN. They announced the collapse of this building at 11:07. They said that it came down at 10:45. Watch this.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a fire.
Now, that's Building 7 they're looking at. But we don't have a 50-story building, any 50-story building. We don't have any building that collapsed. There were some damaged buildings, and none of them collapsed. They just were damaged by the debris that came down from the World Trade Center skyscraper. Had this building collapsed at that time, at 10:45, when they announced that it came down, it would have. We wouldn't have any video of it because of the massive cloud of debris that completely would have obscured it. And maybe it was supposed to come down at that time, and that those construction workers who were telling us that it's going to blow up, maybe they were supposed to be fixing a dud at that time, because that was in the late morning. after it didn't come down. So anyway, that's a theory. They were going to fix a dud that didn't go off, maybe. What were you going to say, Patrick?
Well, I mean, no airplane hit Building 7, and so the argument for explosives in the building is a lot stronger. But also, when you analyze the Twin Towers, there's also evidence of controlled demolition.
And we'll do that. We'll do exactly that. But first, let's listen to the owner of Building 7, the developer. In the late 80s, mid 80s, he developed this piece, and then he acquired the Twin Towers and the other 6 buildings, all becoming part of the World Trade Center complex. And he acquired the Twin Towers just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. But this is what he's saying.
Insurance policies. He made a lot of money on the insurance policies for those buildings, correct?
Oh, absolutely, he did. $5.87 billion. But here's what he said in October of 2002, 2 years later, about Building 7's collapse.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
What? We watched the building, they made the decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse? Well, what did he mean by that? Pull it is a term used in controlled demolition to bring a building down by explosives. So he says, oh, I didn't mean that. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building.
And the insurance companies just handed him the money with no pushback, no investigation.
Well, it appears that some of the insurance companies were some of the ones who profited from the put options that were placed on the airliners that the betting that the value of which would go down the next day after 9/11. They would have lost millions, but instead they made millions. So there was an investigation into that insider trading, but they determined that it wasn't insider trading because it didn't lead to Osama bin Laden. That's per the 9/11 Commission report.
Reasoning. That's the circular reasoning that we were talking about. Yeah, incredible, incredible.
And of course, the firefighters weren't in the building. They weren't allowed to fight the fires. Again and again, they were told not to fight the fires because the building's coming down on its own.
It's interesting that many times when we in the September 11th Truth Movement, when we want to talk about this, a phrase that's we hear is conspiracy theory, or we're conspiracy theorists. But when you analyze the arguments of the officialdom, it really is this kind of assuming the conclusion and the government's investigating themselves.
Yes.
And it's really incredible that this crime could happen and the world would just buy it hook, line, and sinker.
Yes, this happens again and again and again. They're very good. And if you own the media, 95% of which is owned by just 5 corporations, then you have that degree of control that you need. And who profits from 9/11? The media, the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, all owned by Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock, all of whom are owned essentially by the same entity, which goes back to the Rothschilds. So it's a fascinating lineup. If you want to know who to start looking at, you could, you wouldn't be far if you started your search there. But back to the technical explanation of this building's collapse, we have the top European controlled demolition expert.
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Okay, so many experts, by the way, 36 structural engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation. One of them, Kamal Obaid in the San Francisco Bay Area. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns, make that all, at key locations within the building. And the all part of it is explained by Professor Leroy Hulsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country in Alaska. The University of Fairbanks did a 4-year finite element analysis of the building, the study that NIST was paid to do by Congress, but which failed miserably due to abundant fraud. And what do they find? Well, let's see. The US government NIST report computer model on the right, a video in the center of the building's collapse, and the University of Alaska's computer model on the left. Now, what NIST did on the right is to fail 400 structural steel connections every second, and they still couldn't get the building to fall. It begins to tip over, even when they had control over the input data. And it also crumples up like a beer can, which you'd actually expect in any natural collapse. So they completely disproved their own theory.
And after that happened, so is there evidence of explosives in the debris in the rubble?
Yep, we're going to get to that too.
Okay.
And then, so the University of Alaska on the left said, no, the only way to get this building to fall is to remove all the columns. So they say fire did not cause the collapse of this building. Temperatures were not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. The building was a global failure involving the near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building, not a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. So they've pulled the rug out from underneath the NIST report. And this is why more and more engineers are questioning what they've been told by NIST. So what could have caused the failure of all the columns in the building? Well, we have to look at additional evidence given to us in the aftermath, evidence of extreme heat, provided to us by FEMA itself in the appendix of their Building Performance Assessment Team report in May of 2002. It's a metallurgical examination of the steel. What did it show? Never before observed eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Rapid oxidation and sulfidation. They don't know where the sulfur came from. Liquid iron and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. What does this sound like? This is the evidence of incendiaries, which work by means of heat. We'll talk more about that. But the New York Times called it the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, and yet is completely ignored by NIST and omitted in their final report. They threw out this appendix and started over. We can't have that in our report. So we have the presence of sulfur. Where in the world would that come from? We have steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, wait, where are we going to get it? This takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. This fire protection engineer with FEMA is saying it was evaporated, but where do those temperatures come from? Fires burn only about 500 degrees, especially these fires, maybe 1,000 degrees at the hottest Fahrenheit. So where, Hang on a second. I've got a cat out of control. I'll be right back. This is crazy.
Okay, we're talking
bothering me.
Richard Gage.
Don't worry, I'll be right.
Who's now on his own. Richard Gage, 9/11. He's the founder of former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And he's with us today talking about the collapse of Building 7 and the explosive evidence that he's uncovered.
And the Twin Towers too.
Yeah. The explosive evidence for controlled demolition and how there's really been a cover-up, and how most of the world still today, if you ask them how many towers collapsed on 9/11, they would say 2. I would venture to say most New Yorkers and most people around the world still don't know that a third skyscraper collapsed that day, Building 7, which is the wild card in this. We're back with you, Richard.
Oh, thank goodness. I've never heard the cat meow so loud. He was like after something, so we put him outside and he'll deal with it. Oh, anyway, we have the melting of girders in the World Trade Center, also corroborated by this structural engineer, Abolhassan Astani-Azam. And he was given a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel. He says, I saw a melting of girders at the World Trade Center. He doesn't know how temperatures got that hot. But from the photos that we have of the debris picked out of the pile by the World Trade Center, by these buckets of the excavators, dripping with molten metal, yellow and white hot. We know it's exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,371 Celsius. Do you guys use Celsius in Ecuador or Fahrenheit? Which one? Oh, which one do you guys use? Latin America. When you use Celsius or Fahrenheit?
We use Celsius.
Celsius.
Okay, good. Because I have a choice I can make. Like here, jet fuel only burns 200 to 300 degrees Celsius. So we're talking exceeding 1,300 degrees Celsius here. No, not from the jet fuel. It's not from the fires. The fires burn maybe a little bit hotter than jet fuel, typical office fires, but nowhere near 300 degrees, nowhere near 1,300 degrees Celsius. So what is going on here? We got to get to the bottom of this. Could thermite be responsible? It's an incendiary. Let's listen.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel.
Well, interesting. We might be getting somewhere here, because now we can explain the massive temperatures here exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. Would there be any evidence of ignited incendiaries in the dust? Well, let's look, because it's given to us on a silver platter by the United States Geological Survey. What do they find in their 2005 report of their studies of all the dust in the particle atlas, they call it? They find molten molybdenum. For one, molybdenum is a metal that actually melts at 4,700 degrees. So they've documented a metal that doesn't even melt. This is Celsius, this is Fahrenheit, about half that, 2,300 degrees Celsius, maybe. Here it is, 2,600 degrees Celsius. Extremely high melting temperature. Well, where did those temperatures come from? Lead evaporated, according to the R.J. Lee Group, who did independent studies of the World Trade Center dust. They're an environmental consulting firm. The presence of lead oxide on the surface of mineral wool indicates the existence of extremely high temperatures, more than 1740 degrees Celsius, during the collapse, causing metallic lead to volatilize, oxidize, and finally condense on the surface of the mineral wool. This is all evidence of something extremely hot, and in this case, producing previously molten iron microspheres. Let's unpack that. Molten, meaning about 1600 degrees Celsius. Iron, we haven't used iron in our skyscrapers or structural steel in about 100 years. Where's the iron, elemental iron, cast iron coming from? And spherical. We'll talk about how it got into spheres. These are about the diameter of a human hair on average. The EPA says, well, we want to use these as a signature component to distinguish the World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. They're so ubiquitous. They're everywhere. In fact, up to 4 tons in all the World Trade Center dust of these previously molten iron microspheres. And R.J. Lee says these are formed during the event. So they document them independently. Go ahead.
You and your team, your former team, you were able to get some of the rubble and analyze it. Wasn't the
actually we
rubble
have
shipped
been
off to China?
Well, we'll get to that. But this evidence is provided in publicly available documents by the U.S. Geological Survey in their 2006 Particle Atlas of the World Trade Center dust, and a document by R.J. Lee, which is has been put out by them, Composition and Morphology of the World Trade Center dust, in December of 2004. But how would we get those molten iron microspheres? Well, let's do an experiment. Experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. Let's do one. Let's light some thermite in a controlled experiment. Well, here we have a little bit of thermite and a lot of sparks. Well, they look like sparks, but they're not sparks. They're molten iron droplets, and they cool and they fall into the pan as spheres. Why? Well, that's just what aerosolized liquid does. It forms itself into spheres by the surface tension. So in the case of molten iron, they cool and they fall, or before they cool, they fall. Could that be what's an explanation or the cause of the toasting of the tops of these cars around the World Trade Center? Because they're awfully damaged. What other rational explanation is there in this very high heat event toasting the tops of these cars? And if that was all evidence of ignited thermite, and it can only be that, is there any evidence of unignited thermite in the World Trade Center dust? And yes, a team of 8 international scientists led by this gentleman, Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, identify 7 collected samples and study them meticulously. They find these red and gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, dual layered chips of what they thought were paint, but they're attracted by a magnet. And the magnet it pulls them aside and they can study them. And when they do, they find that the red layer, which they wanted to study now, since it has such a high iron content, much higher than paint or primer paint particularly, the iron is found in the material, but also aluminum. Iron and aluminum are the key ingredients of thermite, this incendiary that can burn through steel like a hot knife through butter. And so they're going, whoa, what is the the ingredients of thermite doing in all of this steel? Well, we have
three of the three skyscrapers, all three of them, correct?
Well,
had
yes.
evidence of thermite.
Yes, this dust is ubiquitous everywhere around World Trade Center 7, around the Twin Towers, and as far away as the Brooklyn Bridge, and filling the Deutsche Bank building across the street with up to 6% of the dust being molten iron microspheres. But these are the actual chips. They're found in the dust everywhere too.
The implications here are very dark because Islamic terrorists living in a cave wouldn't have been able to get control of this military grade nanothermite, correct?
Exactly, that material.
I agree with you. And what did you say, Ahmed?
I was like, because I heard something about that. Were there people who worked in the towers that were told not to go in that day?
Yeah, we'll get to that. That's an excellent question. But I, as an architect, and as an architect presenting technical evidence, prefer to stay in line with what I can prove. That I cannot prove. Others have claimed they can prove it. It's an important part of the
That
overall
also supports
story.
the same idea, exactly.
Yeah. Same idea as what?
I mean, like, if we could prove that there were people who didn't come that day, they were told not to come, so that will prove the same. What
the inside job?
Inside job, exactly.
Narrative.
Well, yes, there's a whole number of ways to prove this is an inside job, and that the individuals who are on the inside turn out to be from a variety of international sources.
Such as?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
So they do deeper studies with a nuclear microscope, and they find that these particles of aluminum and iron oxide, the ingredients of thermite, are found at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. And this is incredibly high-tech stuff. And so they find that it's embedded in organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic material is what gives TNT, RDX, its expansion, rapid expansion that knocks things over. Whereas thermite incendiaries work by means of heat, massive heat, 2000 degrees Celsius heat. And so we have something going on here that's been proven that's a real problem. And they found in the peer-reviewed literature that's already been discovered and developed prior to 9/11, it's called super thermite. Lawrence Livermore Lab has published papers on this. Pyrotechnic and explosive composites based on thermite reactions, intimately mixed on the nanometer size scale. Because when you get this stuff so small, its surface volume increases exponentially, and you get instantaneous chemical reactions. So it's very, very sophisticated. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. And in those laboratories, they study the thermal behavior of these chips in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter. And when these chips ignite in the peer-reviewed literature here from Lawrence Livermore Lab at about 420 degrees Celsius, they produce a lot of energy. So it's an exothermic reaction. Well, that's exactly what these particular 4 samples did that were put in the DSC. They ignite at about 420 Celsius. Paint doesn't do this. So this is not paint. What happens when they ignite? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found and documented in the World Trade Center dust by R.J. Lee and the USGS. So we know exactly where those previously molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these chips, these red-gray chips, as you see here in this photo of a partially ignited red-gray chip. And they're found attached to that.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the rubble bears the signature of some labs that are in the United States?
Bears signature of nanothermite or super thermite, an exact signature, which was developed in Lawrence Livermore Lab and probably Los Alamos Lab as well. So we know exactly where to go to begin to find out how this stuff got in all the World Trade Center dust samples and how it was able to bring down the towers. Again, this is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. So we know where to go, right? It's just all peer reviewed in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. The red layer is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. So this is 25 pages. You can look it up. Just look up active thermitic materials in the World Trade Center dust and Google it, and it comes right up. It was peer reviewed in 2009. And we have this evidence is among the 10 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic features in this case of destruction with incendiaries. And not one of these can be explained by fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial evidence, eyewitness testimony we've been looking at. This becomes proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we have got convinced more than 30,000 combined years of technical experience in the building industry. All engineers and architects signed on to the petition publicly demanding a new investigation. And many of them will be appearing in our new film series of 30 episodes starting September 8th in just a week and a half. 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom, an unprecedented film series taking the hard evidence of the 9/11 crimes to court. And so people can co-produce this. We're making it in concert with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, where we're teaming up our experts with their attorneys, specifically litigation director Mick Harrison, who has already been filmed with us in the boardroom presenting to our stand-in virtual grand jury. And we have filmed 30 episodes. We're editing it now, and the first one comes out in a week and a half on the website. Where's the website? The website is 911c2c.org. 911 letter C, number 2, letter C.org. And we're encouraging everybody to watch and take part in the film. We've got a platform where you can provide your assessment of each episode and the evidence, ask your questions, let us know who you would like the grand jury to not indict, that is indict, that's their job, one of their jobs, but also to subpoena as witnesses.
It seems like without a real congressional investigation, limited in terms of but I want to ask you, Richard, now that the political leadership in Washington may be changing and we have Donald Trump and Robert Kennedy Jr. working with him, is there any evidence that these guys might be interested in looking at I know Trump hates the neocons. Have you gotten anywhere talking with political politicians in Washington, or do you have any insights?
Well, we've gone to Washington every 3 years and presented our latest DVD, our latest booklet, our latest petition. When we got to 1,000 engineers, 2,000, and then 3,000, they have all been made aware several times of the evidence. They haven't done anything that we're aware of yet. But I think the tide is changing. You mentioned a couple of emerging forces in that's evolving toward waking up the American people. And we hope to ride on the coattails of these anti-authoritarian movements. So I can't give you evidence that anything's happening yet regarding 9/11. Not till we get this film out anyway, because I think it will travel widely through the process of public education, be a force for public education, especially when they look at the evidence for the Twin Towers, because it's so much more convincing than the Building 7. And just look at both towers, in this case, simultaneously coming down. They're 15 minutes apart in reality, but look how identical they are, with upward, outward, arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying structural steel sections, trailing thick white smoke clouds of aluminum oxide ash. Remember, steel is not flammable in office fire conditions. Why is the steel trailing these thick white smoke clouds? Why are they ejected up to 600 feet in every direction, clocked by physicists at 80 miles an hour? This is not a building collapse, neither of them. This is a building being blown apart. And that's the evidence that will take another 40 minutes to present. And I'm wondering if you want to do that now, or if you'd like to come back for part 2 and make it a series.
Yeah. What do you say, Ahmed? It's your call.
Okay.
Okay. So like next Sunday?
Oh, I think we can do that. I told you it'd be an hour, but I didn't quite get through it in an hour, did I? Yeah, you bet. We can schedule that after we close out here.
Could you tell us a little bit about Dr. Stephen Jones?
Yes, he is a nuclear physicist who studied the dust along with R.J. Lee's study, which we looked at, and the study of the U.S. Geological Survey, finding extreme temperatures himself in his study of the World Trade Center dust, and corroborating their work along with the work of Niels Harrit with the finding of red-gray chips of nanothermite in all the World Trade Center dust samples.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we can have part 2 about it. And before we finish, so in general, like, were Muslims involved, even Muslims who were working in the CIA in that time, like, as the word that you said,
the patsies, Muslim patsies, intelligence agencies. What's your take on?
Well, you have Muslims that were alleged to have hijacked these planes and flown them into buildings. These pilots, if you can call them that, failed Cessna flying school and did very poorly, particularly Hani Hanjour, who was accredited with flying the plane into the Pentagon, which plane did a 270-degree spiral, dropping 3,000 feet per minute for a total of 8,000 feet before leveling off and ramming the front of the building at ground level, something that most pilots couldn't even accomplish in a flight simulator. And neither could they have hit a 200-foot wide target here at 500 miles an hour, because that plane is, it's not like you're on a freeway going 60 miles an hour. You're in the air, and you're all over the place. So the pilots for 9/11 Truth, the 9/11 pilot whistleblowers of 911pilots.org, a website I refer you to, suggest that they could not fly these paths and hit their targets at those speeds. So, and that makes sense if you just think about the fact that explosives, as we'll see next week, were indeed also responsible for the destruction of the Twin Towers. Why would they trust a pilot who failed Cessna flying school to land in the Twin Towers, giving them their excuse to then have a major fire, which they claim caused the collapse of these buildings due to fire substantially, and a few broken columns due to the planes. But NIST says, no, that was substantially the fire that brought those buildings down. Well, you have to have the planes hit the buildings to have the big fires and the big drama. And then they're Muslims, right? So we're going to go invade Muslim countries, notwithstanding that they were mostly Saudis.
You mentioned about the opium poppies in Afghanistan. Before we close, is there anything you'd like to add about that, about the opium industry?
Yeah, we discussed the massive profits that happened as a result of the takeover of the opium cultivation when we invaded Afghanistan. Before we invaded Afghanistan, the Taliban had shut down the production of opium when they came into power. This is one of the things they did. They took control of the drug lords and so forth, and they shut it down to just 187 metric tons. That's down from 2,600 metric tons. Well, after we kicked out the Taliban in 2001, the opium production skyrocketed to 3,700 metric tons. And then a couple of years later, in 2006, it skyrocketed further to about 6,000 metric tons per year. These are UN numbers. So under our watch, the opium production had an order of magnitude increase, several orders of magnitude. So now we know what was going on in Afghanistan. In addition to that, the pipeline of natural gas was intended to go through Afghanistan because the countries to the north were gas rich, and the countries to the south, Pakistan and India, were gas starved. So Afghanistan is the perfect opportunity to get that gas through if you can work a deal with with the Taliban. But the UNICAL was delayed in their negotiations with Pakistan. And so, Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was therefore negotiating with a Brazilian company. So, so Richard Armitage, representing the United States, UNICAL, told them in a meeting in Europe, in Germany, Hamburg, I think, that they will either be issued a carpet of gold or a carpet of bombs. They have their choice. In other words,
you said that before 9/11?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well before 9/11. Apparently, they made the wrong choice because they got the carpet of bombs. I guess they didn't believe that would be happening.
Yeah.
So the carpet of gold would be theirs if they played ball and allowed Unocal to develop this gas pipeline. So that's more about Afghanistan. And not only that, the geostrategic goal of obtaining Afghanistan puts the US military bases, the largest one in the world that we had, on the border of Iran, which was Israel's and the US's, therefore, enemy. So we already had on the other side, what? Iraq. So we have Iraq and Afghanistan, the two countries we invaded following 9/11, now surrounding Iran in complete perfect position to begin that invasion, which was decades in coming, and the goal of the Project for a New American Century, which was a think tank created by top neocon leaders.
The
who
Project
said
for the New American Century, which was a group of neocons that later became part of the Bush administration. And then they said that in order to achieve their goals, they needed a terrorist attack.
Well, what
like
they
a new
said,
Pearl Harbor.
what they wrote in their white paper, well before 9/11, rebuilding America's defenses, that they established their goals of Middle East hegemony, space dominance, a vast increase in the military budget on the order of $75 billion. But they said, absent a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, these goals will likely take a long, long, long time. Well, they got their new Pearl Harbor. Bush, in fact, wrote that in his diary on the night of 9/11.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Richard, so much, and we'll look forward to part 2 next week.
Good. I'm looking forward to it too. Thanks, guys, very much.
Thank you, Richard, so much.
Okay, Patrick, Ahmed, thank you, guys.